who will be giving some opening remarks.
Hi, thanks, Lynn. Just briefly, Lynn asked me to give a little bit of an overview, and I also talked with my other colleagues at Austin. First of all, just thank you to CaLP and to all of the speakers today for sharing their experiences, as well as to the participants. One of the things with a little bit of a global perspective I think we've seen is that we want to obviously avoid having to reinvent the wheel and going through the challenges of figuring out how do we define an MEV and gather all this. A couple of things just to highlight maybe. One would be the importance of getting this right. I think whoever had the question of how important is this anyway, at least to us, it's really important. It makes it much easier to harmonize among different partners. It makes it a lot easier for us to have something reliable that we can go to as a reference if there's both a quality MEV as well as quality gap analysis to help inform a transfer value. Since obviously we're hardly ever wanting to provide or needing to provide 100% of people's needs. We want to use a working group's MEV. It makes our job a lot easier, but then it does need to have a fit quality process. We think it's also really important and critical to work well with the sector clusters to inform not just what are the basic needs in various sectors, how much they cost, but is this a need that's appropriate to meet through cash? Is cash alone going to be accessible, or are there complementary interventions that we need to make sure that are happening? What's the quality of what's available out there in the market? A few of the remaining questions that we see, one is sort of what should be in the MEV, what is necessary for life with dignity. Are we really focusing on sort of these essential needs? Sometimes we'll see things that are more like livelihoods assets in an MEV, which to us is a different intervention. So maybe getting a little bit more standardized. Of course, there's going to be variation by country in terms of what's appropriate, but having a little bit better of a shared understanding around what goes into that, I think would be great. Another is sort of coordinating with safety nets. I think this pulls into the question that somebody had about what if there's several MEVs. What if there is already one in the country? We've seen that sometimes it can be wildly out of date. For example, when we started working in Ukraine, and I think there was one from the 90s, where the prices were completely irrelevant. Or maybe what if there is one, but it's not really quite right for our target population. Let's say we're working with people who come in from another country, and it's more appropriate to a host population, or it's at a level higher that we're trying to meet for a true minimum. Another remaining question is sort of what's the best practice, or is there one, in terms of having a national rate, which makes things a little bit easier versus having regional fluctuations, which can make it a little bit more accurate, but also slightly more challenging. Related to that, dealing with price volatility, and especially where price volatility maybe affects certain areas of the country more than others. Our Food for Peace colleagues say sometimes they recommend having sort of a floating transfer value based on the market prices, but keeping a steady percentage of needs. I think this can be especially challenging if we've got major price volatility in one area of the country, but not others, especially if we do have, say, one national rate, then that can be exceedingly challenging. Or if there's a place like Yemen and there is no real official exchange rate, then we're getting into, it's not easy territory. How often is too often, or not often enough to update those values. Having thrown out all of the challenges, maybe I'll turn it back to everybody to find more the answers. But again, thanks to all of you. I'm really looking forward to talking more about this. I think this is a really rich area that we've seen as we get more into multi-purpose cash programming for something where more learning and more exchange can only be to the good. So thank you.
Thanks, Laura. Now we'll turn over to Natalie, who's going to give us a bit of a technical refresher to remind us what MEVs are, terminology, why it's important.
Thank you, Lynn. I hope that people can hear me. So I'm not putting myself as an expert on MEV, right? Just to make it clear, and there are very also different understanding of what the minimum expenditure basket is. So I will draw on what's the most common approach from the discussions I've had with partners, and I hope that this meeting is also the opportunity to discuss and share our different understanding of what we understand is an MEV. I think that we can all agree that the concept of MEV has started from the concept of multi-purpose cash grants and acknowledging that the different sector-specific needs are intertwined and that beneficiaries don't think their needs as sector-specific needs. They have needs, and we put some labels on those needs. And the recognition that it's more efficient very often to do as much as possible one transfer instead of several transfers to the same population. So in that regard, the multi-purpose cash grants have been seen as sort of emergency safety net for crisis-affected population. And then comes the question of, so if we have to do more than one transfer for the same population, how do we calculate it, considering that sectors used to do their own calculation of their sector-specific needs and cash transfer amount. So I was planning to do some drawings, but now I'm not sure if I should go for the drawings, considering that people seem to have quite some knowledge of MV. I will start. And if my drawings make no sense, just stop me. I can still use the jet lag excuse to So the idea is that the minimum expenditure, the minimum expenditure basket is a tool that should inform the design of MPC, that should also at some point inform the monitoring to let us better understand how much of the needs we are actually covering, and not just give transfers that the needs are covered, which we see very often in emergency context, but to better capture, if those were the needs, how much of them are we covering? It can also be an advocacy tool, as Laura was mentioning. In many contexts, we have governments launching national safety net programs, and so how much of the specific humanitarian needs are being covered or could be covered through the safety nets, and how much remains uncovered then. So I will start with the baseline, where we were. Pressure. So this is basically the humanitarian need, you can see. So we used to we still respond very much to try to cover those needs in sector-specific approach. So those are the sectors, right? And among the sectors, some were already using cash quite a lot, like the food security sector, of course. So a large part of the food security response were covered in cash, and some other sectors like wash or shelter could do some cash, and other sectors will not do cash at all. For many reasons we know, either cash not being appropriate, feasible, or just lack of capacities and understanding of how cash could contribute to cover those needs. So the sector-specific approach was used for both the design of the response, the assessment, the response itself, and monitoring. So all of those different steps of the program cycle was done at sector-specific level. What changes with the MEB, or should change at least, is that now we still have, unfortunately, those humanitarian needs, of course, but the idea is that within the response, we have some basic needs that are not sector-specific. That is a more comprehensive idea of what are the key needs that we should cover to ensure the minimum and distant survival of our beneficiaries. So this is what the famous basic needs that we call, and among those basic needs, there is a part of it that can be covered in cash. And so the MEB aims at defining, it looks strange, but it's hack for breakfast, right? So this is the part that cash should cover as part of the basic need response. But then, of course, you still need sector-specific response, not only as complementary activity, because as you see, there's still a lot to cover through other modalities, but also we still need sector-specific expertise to inform the calculation of the MEB. So the idea is that the MEB is not just an addition of sector-specific needs. It's beyond that. It's really trying to understand how those needs are intertwined and how we can calculate and take into account the needs that are prioritized by our beneficiaries without labeling them as wash or shelter. Some needs, for example, if a family is saying that breakfast is priority for their kids, it may not be just because the kids are hungry in the morning when they wake up, but because breakfast is the entry point to go for the kids to go to school. If they have no breakfast, they won't go to school. So we can label it as a food security need, but it's also very much an education need. And taking out the labels really enables us to say, okay, if we manage to cover this need, then we have a multiplier effect and positive effect on other sectors. And among those needs, what can be covered in cash? And this is what the MED aims at identifying. So, of course, it doesn't mean that sectors are out of the picture. On the very contrary, we need sector-specific expertise in determining the standards, for example, all the sphere standards. How do we take them into consideration when we calculate the MED? If we take into account, for example, the access to potable water or to hygiene and stuff, how do we make sure that we integrate the minimum standards for those different sectors? And as Laura was saying, the expertise of each sector should definitely be incorporated in the MEB calculation. Also, in terms of MEB, of monitoring and evaluation, for now, and there are some process and discussions going on, but we have not yet understood really how we can do some joint monitoring and evaluation against the MEB. So there are still needs for sector-specific indicators, and it's important that we, looking ahead and moving forward, we find a way of capturing at monitoring and evaluation level, how can we better measure the impact of cash transfers and beyond humanitarian interventions against those basic needs, and going beyond an addition of sector-specific indicators. So I'm not sure if the drawings were actually very helpful, but you tell. So to summarize a bit, the key elements to take into consideration when working with the MEB is that first, the basic need approach is broader than just the MEB. The MEB is just a part of the basic needs that can be covered by cash. It doesn't mean neither that the MEB equals the transfer amount. We know that the transfer amount should be based on the gap analysis. So you have the MEB, what part of the MEB can be covered by the household themselves, and then of course we have constraints of funding and capacities and stuff. So the basic needs approach is broader than the MEB, and within the MEB there is again the transfer amount. When you calculate the MEB, it's very important that you set a clear objective. We've seen countries with survival minimum expenditure basket, others consider that MEB per se is to cover survival needs. How do you calculate the MEB when you're in a country with large national government-led programs to build resilience of your households? In West Africa, we have a lot of countries that were in developing context and that have been affected by crisis. For example, Cameroon has large or is developing at least safety net programs, and Niger government is now expanding their safety net program to the crisis-affected areas. How do we connect this? How does it influence the way we design our MEB? There is also a critical step in terms of defining roles and responsibilities, because as you've seen, at least I hope from my drawing, is that the approach of an MEB calculation questions how we work across sectors, how we work together, and it can be a challenge to the existing coordination mechanisms. So we have to have this initial discussion. What are the roles and responsibilities? What are the contributions from the sectors? What is the role of the cash working group or the intercluster group? And what should the decision-making process look like? Who is in charge of reviewing the MEB, of approving it? In many countries in West Africa, to the humanitarian country team level to approve and to be included in the HRP. But there are many steps before that, sectors approval, ICCG approval and stuff. As I said, MEB is not just an addition of sector-specific needs, and to some extent, MEB is never perfect. You know, we have a lot of these never perfect things in our sector. The targeting is another one, but definitely the MEB, depending on where you stand, you will never be satisfied, like fully satisfied with an MEB. It's just a consensual approach of what we consider as the cash portion of the basic needs. And so we have to be pragmatic while looking for the best possible quality. And from the experience we have, there is definitely a tension between trying to ensure the uptake and the national uptake of the MEB to make sure that it reached the goal of harmonization and having whole sectors and organizations aligned behind this MEB, while building on the most possible technical expertise and the best quality, and very often not to undermine any of the work that we've been doing at country level, but the expertise is not always sitting in the groups and in countries where the decision and where the work is actually being made on MEB. So there is a tension here that we have to be aware of and consider. In terms of challenges, I think that Laura mentioned quite a lot of them, but probably one of the main challenges that at the beginning of the MEB, as I said, is the multi-purpose cash grant concept, and there's still no common understanding of what we put behind that concept. And when translating in the MEB work, it's sometimes raised, and you can see, okay, it's not so clear for everyone what we are trying to achieve and what would be the next step after this MEB work. From experience also, the MEB at the end, or what people call MEB, is rarely actually, the MPG, are not actually linked to the MEB. So you can spend months in trying to calculate the MEB, and at the end, people would just go for the easy way of aligning with the National Safety Net program, which nobody really knows what's covering and what are the needs, and it's really allowing us to achieve our goals for our target population. So there is this central question of how do we articulate the work on MEB with the safety net, with the minimum wage, with the poverty line. And in many countries, we should indeed just ask the question, do we even need an MEB? Should we work on an MEB? That's the question. And MEB was initially coming from the Middle East with very acute humanitarian crises. So we should maybe ask ourselves, do we need to calculate an MEB in every context? The selection of items, we'll go probably back to that in the panel discussion. The item selection and what should we take into consideration in the MEB is always indicative, and it should build on the objective of your MEB, of course, the assessments you do at sector level and with communities, but also what are the priorities of our beneficiaries and, of course, the availability and market assessment. Sometimes you see that for your objective and for the needs that you assess, you need, for example, to include school bags in your MEB. It's available on the market and stuff, but then when you talk with the beneficiaries, it's very unlikely that they will prioritize school bags if they have money to buy it. So how do we take all of this into consideration, considering that at the end, it's always the aim is to give unrestricted cash. So all the item list that you include in your MEB is only indicative, doesn't mean that the people will actually purchase that. And then a lot of more technical questions around the seasonality, the frequency of the transfer, and how do we work and how do we play with the one-off transfers. Don't try to put everything in your MEB. There is a lot of cash, sector-specific cash that will remain out of the MPG. So there's no point in trying to fit everything in the MEB. The MEB is really for the basic needs, and then you can have cash on top of this for sector-specific outcomes. And then, of course, you might be aware that the global clusters are also like working closely on the questions of MDG and MED, and they are raising some concerns regarding quality. It's very much linked to the reflection that they are undertaking on how cash can be used to achieve sector-specific outcomes. And there is a lot of work that remains to be done with the health cluster, with education. What are the items that can decently be included in the MED, considering also that it's really linked to the specific context where we're working on, and there is no one recipe that will apply across the board and across countries. So that's what the main points I get. I hope it was useful beyond drawing. I don't know if there are questions, or Lynn, should we take questions, or we save them for the panel?
So let's take some questions now and focus, I think, more on the technical aspect.
Okay.
Maybe one question just to draw from the flipboard is the difference between an MEB and survival MEB. Maybe that could be a good kickoff.
Yeah. So I know that in Ukraine there have been two MEBs, survival minimum expenditure basket, and the MEB. In Nigeria also they tried to do it, and very honestly, like in Nigeria, it's the country I know best, it was a bit random. Like it was 70% of the minimum expenditure basket will be the survival minimum expenditure basket, which came from the food security sector that were given 70%, that was covering 70% of the food security needs. This is the type of conversations we have at country level, and looking back at it, you're like, why 70%? Like, my personal view, this is personal, but it's the discussions we've had at country level, is that what is the point of having a survival minimum expenditure basket when the minimum expenditure basket itself is for basic needs? What is below basic needs? And even in, like, you know, when we are working on the minimum expenditure basket as basic needs approach, we are really struggling to work with the sphere standards and the minimum standards, because each time you try to fit with the standards, you realize that the amount of the MEB is really huge, and it's beyond all the minimum wage and safety net amount and stuff like that. So if you cut again to the survival minimum expenditure basket, really there is nothing left to live decently, I guess. So.
This might be slightly, I don't think there's a direct answer to this, but if you could talk a little bit about, you mentioned the question of, do we always need to do a minimum expenditure basket, and when do we decide? And one of the things I think we often grapple with in country is, if you're doing a response where there's already another program, or there's a national safety net, or say the donor already has a pretty clear idea of how much they want to transfer, when and how are you deciding the utility of doing an MEB in order to make sure that that number that you're kind of being handed, whether from harmonizing with the partner or the donor or whatever, is on and accurate? And you know, to what extent, if you do your MEB and you think it's wrong, is there leeway to negotiate? I think it's a really kind of complex question, and as I said, it depends on the country and the context. But if you could talk a little bit about that situation when you almost know that there's already a number out there that you might be expected to meet. How do you go, and maybe donors want to jump in as well?
So from the West Africa experience, defining, like, prioritizing the basic needs, selecting the items, going for an MEB or not, is almost subjective decision. And so what as CaLP we have been, the regional office has been trying to promote, is to really encourage as much collaboration as possible, because we think that working together really decreases that subjective part. And by multiplying points of view and perspectives, you should get to a consensus that is more or less more objective than just, oh, we need to do an MEB because. So as I was saying, we've been working in West Africa in many countries where there was safety net being developed, and unfortunately crisis happening. For example, in northern Mali, or in Cameroon, or in Niger, Mali was very much sort of development context before the crisis hit, and the safety nets were like developing, so the government there was already some harmonization between humanitarian actors and the government in terms of transfer amounts and stuff. But at some point, humanitarian actors and the government, they sat together and they just acknowledged that the situation in the north and the situation in the rest of the country cannot be compared. Like, the needs are different, the gaps are huge, and the amount of the safety nets, though it's the highest in West Africa, if I'm correct, was not at all covering the needs of the affected populations. And so by having this discussion, they decided to go for an MEV definition. In Cameroon, it was more separated because the crisis was really, at that time, it was really affecting the extreme north of the country, and the safety nets were more developed in the rest of the country. So humanitarian actors felt that it was okay to work in an MED just for this specific location where the crisis was quite specific. Now the government is expanding its safety net to the crisis-affected area, and so now there is a question of how do we articulate the work, because if I'm correct, the MED is 3 times the cost of like the amount of the safety net, or maybe it's the minimum wage. But yeah, there will be struggle at this point, and you can either go to the government and convince them that the humanitarian needs are much more higher and it's a temporary assistance, or it should be, and so work on some kind of graduation and how can we then hand over those beneficiaries to the safety net program, or you can work in trying to harmonize, influence the amount of the safety net. But in West Africa, all the safety nets are almost funded by external donors. There is national contribution, but it's not like really budgeted in national budget. And so when you're talking with the government, they don't have all the hands on how much they should be given. There was also, so the safety nets are often defined based on either the poverty line or like some other reference that are available at country level. And there have been some discussion with partners like the World Bank and other donors on should we use it for humanitarian purpose? But very often, first, it doesn't match, as I was saying, with the needs. And the second is it's hard to understand what this poverty line, for example, is covering in terms of needs. So maybe there is like other experiences here.
How far into the process is the beneficiary voice brought along? Because I'm sure there's a number of rounds of refinement and determination and all that. So after initial assessment, like when is beneficiary voice heard again, if it is?
Are there any other questions here in the room? Maybe we can take them together. Okay, we'll go to those online.
Okay. So like, again, there is like other people willing to answer, not like the expert on everything, but if maybe you've had the chance to read the case study. So when you do like a case study or when you draw experience, it seems quite straightforward. Oh, we did that. It's absolutely not straightforward. Like you have often several processes going on in parallel and you're trying to make them match at some point and to reconcile them. And you move forward and then you go backward. And so we had, in almost every country, we had a first round of assessments, either building on secondary data available at sector level or just a new round of assessments being done, sometimes jointly with the cash working groups and sectors, sometimes sectors. It was not so clear. And then we said, okay, well, should we hear about like what the communities have to say to us, especially when it comes to prioritizing? So very often, like I think in Mali and Cameroon, a second round of assessment went with the communities. And then people sit in the room and very honestly, there's no much like space after that for hearing about like the communities. I think in Cameroon they are trying to do it now for the review and update of the MEB, but it's a lot of resources, it's a lot of time for all the processes, and the one particularly that I've worked, there's no dedicated resources to that. So now Mali, Niger, and Chad are both countries where they have been developing a budget to develop the MED, which has very positive effect, and sometimes means that there will be more consensus because all people are on board and you can do it you can plan it better and hopefully go and work better with communities. But on the other hand, it's of course like use of resources and less time to raise the funding and stuff. So people have been just trying to do their best with what they had, and this, yeah. But in Nigeria, thanks to the ERC Global Project, and in Cameroon and Mali, they always manage to find time to go to have focus group discussions with communities and to meet with the vendors on markets. So there has been consultations with communities, but maybe at the early stage of the process. And when you look at what was the time frame to develop the NDD, like at the end, like 6 months after, how relevant it is.
Is there any other feedback perhaps on that question, other experiences from colleagues on involving communities, maybe some other geographical areas?
I have a question. Sorry, I'm late. I don't know whether you already touched on that. By the way, I'm Shelda, and I work for World Vision. We have the authority to develop the MEV when it is not in place for a country, and what is the vetting process like? Is it something that the government has to say, hey, this is the standard MEV for this country, or how is it done?
Should we maybe take that in the panel discussions, because I think quite a lot of this will be coming out there. And then, sorry, I know we're also had a late start, and maybe we can turn it to those online for any questions. Has there any been in the chat box? Okay. Okay. So if there's nothing from our colleagues online, then maybe we will just turn it over to Blake, who'll be facilitating the next kind of panel discussion.
Sure, so we're going to have a couple different perspectives on and some experiences on actually developing MEVs. And actually, we're going to return to Natalie again to talk about some of the specifics of these experiences in West Africa. And then we're going to hear from some colleagues online from WFP who have actually developed an interim guidance on working with MEVs. I personally read it yesterday, finally, to prepare for this, and I was quite impressed, and I think we'll hear some exciting things they've been working on for that. Then we're going to hear from Darren from Save the Children US, who have been working on some ways to use the household economy approach data that already exists in the development process for MEVs. And Dana Brick from CRS is going to end us up with reminders about what are we doing, how quickly do we need to do this, and some experiences she had in Greece and Serbia with the refugee response in Europe. And so some very different contexts that we're going to be hearing from. And we'll try to take questions at the end instead of after each presentation, because hopefully they'll build on each other if we've done this right. Okay, so again, turning the floor to Natalie, and will people online be able to see the presentations now, or will they they'll be able to see them now? Excellent.
Thank you, and sorry, I promised that after that I would keep more quiet. Learning from West Africa. So there have been 5 countries working on MEV definition in West Africa. So starting from Mali and Cameroon, Niger, Chad, and Nigeria. The time frame to develop those MEV is basically from mid-2017, I'd say, and some not being finalized. So so the main challenge for the MEV definition that we faced in the country was very often people started the process because of opportunities for funding for multi-purpose cash grants. And suddenly they looked at each other and say, oh, but we don't have an MEV. And so this is how it started very often. So the have a discussion around what do we understand as basic needs, and what is the basic needs, what is the objective of this MEB, and what are we trying to achieve and to cover. It was skipped in the initial steps, and then it brought a lot of issues when prioritizing the selection of items, when calculating the overall MEB, and trying to ensure minimum uptake from all, because they were not all on the same understanding of what was the MEB for. There was also a lot of challenges in terms of coordination. So to address part of your question, some processes started with one or two agencies being more aware of what the MEB is and willing to take this work forward. And in Nigeria, for example, at some point, we had 3 organizations or agencies working on MEB definition internally. And so our work at CaLP was, we really engaged in this MEB discussion to ensure that we facilitate the collaborative approach at country level. We don't feel that there is one good approach to calculate an MEB. You basically do with what you have and in the best way possible. But one critical step is collaboration, because at the end of the day, MEB is for harmonized approach, interagency assessments and response. And so if you don't work in a collaborative manner since the beginning, you undermine the uptake, and that's the objective of the whole process. So there was a lack of, it was really challenging to define what is the best coordination mechanism to ensure appropriate cash expertise is feeding the process while ensuring sector representation across the board. And so cash working groups often in several countries set up subgroup or task teams with focal points or cash or sector representatives to ensure this facilitate the process. And then there was also a challenge of ensuring that it's not just a technical discussion, but that we have a strategic overview of the process to make sure that it links with the safety net and the basic needs, and how does it fit with the overall humanitarian planning. And in Cameroon, Cameroon was the country with the highest level of engagement and strategic buy-in, and it was the first country to finalize MEB, and really helped a lot to have the HC and the whole HCT following up the process and putting a final push to make it happen and to finalize it. I think this is what we see in Mali and in other countries, but we don't have a strategic push, and so there is no one to say, okay, this is good enough, let's move forward with it. So the sector engagement I talked about already. One challenge, of course, and we have to be very open about it, is the technical expertise. MEB is a very new concept. I mean, I'm explaining to you, but you're all as qualified as I am to tell what an MEB is. There is no perfect definition, common understanding, and one good approach. So we were really learning as we were going, and until now, some people in charge of working in the MEB definition, they're struggling with this concept. They are just struggling with sector-specific requirements and with cash speaking. The level of expertise on cash is it's not what we could expect in many countries, and if you go to each sector, it's even lower, and so combining the two is quite challenging. And we see that as we're working with the HRP process and finding how cash could be included in sector-specific responses. And finally, in terms of resources, so very often we're tempted to say, oh, we should put dedicated resources for that MEB, and I'm really careful of what I'm saying, as there are so many colleagues from OFDA and is around, but I'm not saying that we should not have dedicated resources, but we need to be careful in how we use those resources. Cameroon was the only country among the 5 with absolutely not dedicated resources, no specific projects, no study, no deployment, no experts coming, and it was the first country to finalize the MEB. It's not a perfect MEB, but none of the others are perfect MEB anyway. But they were really they shared resources, they used what was available, they were really collaborative, and also the strategic engagement, as I said, was really helpful. In other countries, we had specific projects that came to lead assessments. We had deployment from HQ, from CaLP, and other experts coming to push the process. And honestly, the intermediary like draft studies or NEDs were strong and like good enough. But when you look around, no one understands what it is, how it has been calculated. And so the MEB is put in a corner, and then it basically delays by 6 months or more the whole process, because you have to start almost from the beginning to explain to people why we did this assessment and how we should build on findings. So it's important to add resources and to build capacity, but my take is that it's more important to ensure the uptake, the collaborative approach, and to make sure that those resources you're adding are going through national channels and actually build capacity at country level, and not just be ad hoc resources that no one knows how to use.
Thank you so much for that, Natalie. Now we're going to turn the floor over to Lena to talk about some of WFP's experience, and again, a plug for their guidance document if you've not had a chance to look at it yet. Quite rich source of information and different ways one could approach developing MEB.
Now I'm on. Hi, everyone. My name is Lena. I'm here with my colleagues Sergio and Nuno, which you can't see. Presentation. Can you hear me fine?
Sorry, the lawnmower going to. Not everything here.
That was a yes, huh? I guess so.
Okay, we can hear you.
Okay, that's good. So we want to talk today about like our approach, or that we at the moment figured out is most appropriate for us, the hybrid MEB models, and we're going to talk about potential and also challenges that we face while applying this MEB approach. First of all, it's very important to see for us that MEB is not a thing as such, which we do just on its own, but it's included in, or it's part of a more comprehensive analysis. We see MEB as a part of our essential needs assessments. So understanding which people are in need, how many are there, where are they, understanding their needs. Then with a minimum expenditure basket, trying to quantify this in a way. What are their actual needs, and getting a number on this, also for operationalization afterwards, for getting a transfer value, for example. And then it's very important to also not only look at the expenditures, but also like look at the supply side. So doing a supply assessment, a demand analysis, and looking really at the context where we are at the moment, and what kind of needs there are, and what the market can provide, and where it perhaps can also not provide something. Something also to decide whether we can provide in cash or we have to provide in. For us, it was very important to find an approach that works for this. Usually, we would differentiate two main approaches. One is the expenditure-based MEB. This is what the World Bank, for example, uses mainly. So this is really based on expenditure data. You have like a very large LSMS, for example, with very detailed information on food consumption that you can use for this. This is mostly what is used to calculate national poverty lines, right? Of course, it's like very detailed in the food consumption, not so detailed in the non-food expenditures. And it has also it has a variety of disadvantages, which we see. For example, you can't apply it when all are poor. You have, of course, very high data requirements. And it can fail if the market is not able to provide all the, to satisfy all the needs that are there. Then we have on the other side the rights-based approach, which is more taken over by the humanitarian sector, where we from outside, with information from beneficiaries based on focus groups and so on, try to define what are actually the rights and what are the needs, and then giving prices to this. We now try to find a way that's somehow in the middle, that's taking like the advantages, hopefully, of both sides, which we call a hybrid model, which is a bit more pragmatic than a fully expenditure-based MEB, which is less requires less data than a full expenditure-based MEV, but which is still based somehow on the behavior. So where we really take into account what people actually buy, what people actually do. And perhaps to go into details, there the most important part in doing that is really to find the people where we look, which we take into consideration for defining the poverty line, for defining who is non-poor and at whose expenditures can we actually look at it as a reference. So we try not to look at like everyone, because then we have like expenditures, of course, of people whose basic needs are not satisfied, but we try to find a population which is just above the poverty line. In the expenditure-based approach, this is done by like having an extensive calorie roster where you really can see what each person or what each household consumes in like hundreds of items, which is not practical for us. We can't do that when we really go to the field and we need an MEV now. So then in the expenditure-based approach, this would like quantify the calories that you actually need to survive and then give a value to that. We try now to use the data that we actually have available, which are from our side, our CFSVAs and the FSAs, so data that is already there, and that has been even there before as a pre-intervention baseline. Those don't have calorie intake. Clearly, it's just too detailed, we can't do that. So we try to use the data that we have there to define a group that is non-poor. And the data that the variables that are used for that, because they're just so easy or relatively easy to get, are, for example, the food consumption score or the coping strategy index or something like a dwelling quality. So for example, we would look for those people who have an acceptable food consumption score and then look what kind of expenditures do they actually have. And the advantage there is also that we can like choose which population we are actually interested in. For the big surveys or for the poverty lines that are available, very often it's not, for example, the refugee population that we're looking at that moment, but it's broader. So for this one, we really can choose which surveys and which population to include, and tailor our approach and our MEV to this situation. We also can like take into account more rights-based perspective while still looking at the behavior. For example, if we say that certain services or goods cannot be provided by the market, are not provided by the market, we can exclude them from the MEV and treat them in a different way. We of course have to be a bit careful, so it's not like a one-fits-all solution. We really have to take into account the context that we face. This means, for example, if we have people who already received assistance, we have to be very careful which variables to take into account, because they might be influenced by the assistance that people receive. Or we have to really take into account whether we have a non-poor population at all. If we don't have that, we can't look at their expenditures, then we would have to turn to a rights-based approach. So this is for now what we've been trying to find, like the right approach for the right context, choosing between or balancing between behavior and needs and rights that we define, always depending on the context. I brought you a little example here. This is an example from Kasai, from DRC, where we calculated MEVs. And actually in Kasai, we had a situation where there was already a SMEV defined on a rights-based approach. The dimensions that were covered were food, education, and health. And the SMEV was set by a Koch working group on $19.4 per capita, as well as the transfer value. We now did like an exercise where we compared this to the actual expenditures. So we had an expenditure survey, and based on our hybrid model, we calculated the mean expenditures and the MEV. That means the mean expenditures of those people who are just above the poverty line, who are non-poor, defined, for example, by the food consumption score. And you see that the values that we have there, that we found there for their expenditures, are way lower than what was defined as an SMEV. For mean expenditures, we had a value of $3.1 US. Of course, this includes people who are poor, so this will be biased downwards. But for those who are non-poor, we had a value of still $7.4 US, which is way lower than the value that was set as the SMAB. So this means that we could still like satisfy the needs of the people with a lower value and serve more people then in the end. And it's quite nice to see that this really also had programmatic impact, because then in Italy, it was taken in while defining the transfer value, our results were taken into account, and was taken into account that perhaps we have to look also at the behavior and have to make sure that we don't inflate the MEB too strongly and get too high with the MEB. So where are we now? We still have several challenges that we face, and looking mainly for approaches also to operationalize our approach. So first is that we want to align it with M&E systems, and we have an indicator that describes the percentage of people above this MEB, with which we are able then, which is only able if you base it somehow on behavior on expenditures. And with this indicator, we are able to monitor vulnerability of the people. Still, it's so we have certain data requirements, and we're still trying to streamline and mainstream this within WFP. Then we want to use the MEB and the expenditures monitoring as a basis for calculation of transfer values. But as you all know, this is not an easy task. So of course, with the gap analysis, we have to make like several steps and making certain assumptions and decisions to find the transfer value. And this is not always 100% clear also to us how to do that. Then we see a clear trade-off between the data accuracy, so that the MEB could be repeated very often, and expenditures could be are changing, for example, due to seasonality, so that updates actually could be made. But then on the other hand, with the programmatic needs, it's very difficult to follow this like data accuracy. So we can't go there and change the transfer value every 2 months. This will be like impossible and very confusing also for beneficiaries. Then I have 2 more points: household size adjustments. When calculating with expenditure-based data, you quite clearly soon realize that it depends so much on the household size, whether you take a per capita approach, you take a household approach, and just small changes in that make a big difference for the people. For example, it would be possible to adjust the household size with equivalence, but the question is that somehow programmatically relevant? Can we take that into operation, or is that just a theoretical approach? So we're looking here also for solutions to this problem. One last thing I want to get your attention to is that with a proper monitoring of the MEB within like hybrid approach, we're able to do also risk assessment. So we have like a model where we can, based on scenarios, give an indication on how we think the situation will evolve over the next month. So with like assumptions on how prices change, we can also assume how the situation of the people changes, getting us in a more proactive situation than just reacting to changes. Okay, thank you very much. I guess there are probably lots of questions, and I'm happy to help you.
Thank you, Lena. We'll go ahead and do the other presentations, but please be writing down your questions as the presentations go along. And Lena and Sergio will stay online and be available for questions in just a minute. Now we're going to have Darren talk about a specific expenditure-based way to work on maybe. And the third one is PowerPoint sharing. Just a second for the PowerPoint for those online who are listening to us, not seeing the exact same screen we're seeing.
Everyone remotely can see it, but we should see it.
Can speak on. What? Excellent. All right.
Hi, everyone. This is Darren on How to Save the Children. So when we started this discussion, we kind of talked about initially how we use the household economic approach to develop our MEBs. And we started thinking about some other innovations that we had been using over the past little while as well. So I'm going to focus initially on the HEA use in MEB development, but then at the end, we'll kind of just touch on some other things that we've been using recently that might be of interest. So just generally, the HEA, we are able to tailor our transfer amounts based on the seasonality and the nature of income and expenditure patterns. And this is a very localized, specific tool that allows us to really address the key needs for the households that we're dealing with at a livelihood zone level. So HEA is traditionally used to analyze a context or a livelihood zone to predict the impact of future shocks on household economies. The information provided in the baseline can also be used to target and select beneficiaries of a program, design a food basket, determine a cash transfer amounts in emergency recovery or development situations, design monitoring tools, determine a household livelihood resilience score, and to evaluate the impact of different projects on household resilience. Now, we've kind of touched upon this already today, and a couple of the different thresholds that HEA helps us to establish, and that's in the survival or livelihood protection threshold. The costs that we are able to accumulate from the HEA are used to define each of these and are based on actual household expenditures from the HEA baseline. They are not based on minimum standards. They will vary significantly between wealth groups, since wealthier households will have greater purchasing power. Now, when we are looking at survival thresholds, we take into consideration three different things. One is a 2100 kcal from the cheapest available staple grain. A second is non-food items essential for survival, such as water for consumption if you have to purchase that. And the third is a means to prepare food, for example, firewood, again, if you have to purchase that. Now, when we're thinking about livelihood protection thresholds, we cost out the survival threshold, and we also add to that health expenditures, such as like medicine and that kind of thing, education costs, such as school fees, productive inputs, seeds, tools, fertilizer, and those sorts of things, non-staple food costs, and household items. Now, some of the examples that we have used over recent past of using HEA in MEB development. In Sierra Leone, our EFSP provided unconditional cash to beneficiaries, offering a choice to select their preferred foods through the most convenient and accessible local markets. In order to ensure that the households were receiving enough cash to cover their kcal needs, locally available commodities were entered into a nut bill calculator to identify a food basket that had cereals, pulses, and oil that would meet a SPEAR standard requirement. This basket was the basis of the original transfer value. However, after the completion of the HEA, a much more complete picture of the household food access, availability, and utilization was evident. Even the poorest households were purchasing beans, sweet potatoes, ground nuts, and fish. Thus, the sweet potato leaves and fresh fish, both available and purchased by households, were also added to increase the nutritional quality of the basket. In Nigeria, we were using a monthly household transfer value representing 70% of a SPEAR basket for a household of 5. The HEA baseline data confirmed that households purchased a range of staples and non-staples. Then the HEA assessment generated both survival and livelihood protection baskets that identified the minimum amount needed to cover both survival and livelihood protection needs. In both Niger and Senegal, MBVs were developed from multiple sectors. This ended up reinforcing the HEA by providing a higher measure of the resources needed to live at a certain standard of well-being and beyond the simple livelihood protection threshold. As these efforts also look to build resilience in the countries of implementation outside of household food security MEV development, the concept of resilience built from MEV reinforces livelihood thresholds analysis and provides a longer-term commitment to raising incomes around minimum standards of well-being. For example, in Niger, poor households spent roughly 6,000 CFAs per year on education, even though the minimum standard set was roughly around 34,000 CFAs annually. This highlights the expenditure gaps that are needed to be bridged in order to maintain a minimum level of education. For the same households, there's an estimated gap of 12,184 CFA to meet the 24,000 CFA basic health costs. In the same study, we saw that roughly 64% of annual expenditures were used on food purchases. We have examples of this across all sectors, but this is one of the big findings we had from the Niger and Senegal example. Some of the limitations that we found, though, for using HEA to develop MEVs, and that is the number and locations of baselines available is pretty limited right now. We're pretty focused in Africa, some areas of Asia, and very limited in Latin America. And these HEA baselines are very extensive and take a lot of effort and a lot of resources to upkeep. And so the next limitation we have is that capacity to undertake the baselines is a continual need. We need to have people always on the ground, always taking information. That takes a lot of time and resources. And finally, from the nutrition perspective, we kind of found this one with, I'll use the example of Guatemala. We developed our HEA baselines and saw what the food baskets would be, but that doesn't necessarily represent the most nutritional baskets. What we have is just their average uses and their average baskets on an annual basis. And so it doesn't necessarily offer us, say, the greatest baskets to hold communities out of levels of malnutrition. Outside of some of the HEA examples, we were looking at some of the innovations that we've used more recently in Latin America and the Venezuela response. Now, we were thinking about, as we're working mostly in Ecuador and Peru, as some of the Venezuelans are starting to arrive, they, with close to no resources, they have depleted all their current resources to pay for the trips to Venezuela. Informal income generation activities are available there, though they do present some protection risks. When we were looking at the people coming through the areas where we were, we kind of saw three different groups of people. We saw the folks who were in transit, folks who were looking to settle, and people who had been settled. So those offered opportunities for different MEVs. For the transit MEVs, we looked at one-off transfers, and these were calculated to cover the cost of 3 nights in a hotel, meals for 3 days, hygiene kit, and transportation to main cities or bordering countries. Now, when we're looking at the settlement MEVs, we had to look at different things. We were looking at 3 months worth of transfers that 3 months was the estimated time frame to get legal residency in country by local authorities. These were multi-sectoral, covering the cost of food, NFI, such as kitchen, sleeping, hygiene kits, shelter or rent, and local transportation. Some of the considerations for this, we needed to think about some of the expenditures only had to be purchased once, and these are the one-offs, and those are then reused the following month. However, they are more expensive to purchase. As a result, 100% of the costs of those expenditures were included in the first month and then excluded during months 2 and 3. These amounts also were calculated based on the number of people in the household instead of an average number household. For example, a household of 6 people would have to purchase 3 mattresses and sets of sheets instead of 1 for a household of 2 adults. hygiene items, some of these items are reusable, like towels and toothbrushes, and others need to be purchased on a monthly basis, such as soap and toothpaste. As a result, the value of the transfer of hygiene items changes between month 1 and months 2 and 3. These are lower, but still partly covered to ensure continued purchase of these perishable NFIs. These amounts also calculated based on number of people in the households, such as we mentioned earlier. Now, based on the assessment, majority of households tend to start generating income within the first month upon arrival. Average monthly income was therefore deducted from the overall value of the MEB. Considering the fact that the Venezuelans will send remittances, whatever happens, average value of remittances was added to the basket. That's one of the key considerations that we had to make too, is why were these people in transit? That was to improve the economic possibilities and futures of their households. So they were moving to send remittances, and that remittance amount needed to be a central figure of what we were developing with these baskets. We had some discussion about the BNAs that we've used in Nigeria and Ethiopia. However, that's already been discussed better than I was actually going to discuss. So I'll just leave that for right now. And I think that just about covers.
Thank you so much, Darren. And I'm sure people are writing down their questions. We have one more presentation about a different set of experiences developing MEBs.
So, thank you. I'm going to talk just briefly about very specific experiences in Greece and Serbia. So these are early days of that crisis, sort of early days of MEBs, actually. And a very specific part of that, which was just like, these were developed in 3 weeks and 1 week. So this is like the first people that were going on the ground and trying to develop these MEBs. And then they were, after that, at least in Greece, were then revised and updated. But I think there's some interesting lessons from sort of that early first response of kind of doing this quickly in all of its delightful imperfections. So just quickly about Greece. So this was back in 2015, and some of you probably were part of this, so please jump in with your experiences also, especially if you were part of the revision process, which I wasn't. So the cash working group was just forming, and in fact, it was sort of just a few NGOs that were starting to come together around cash, and someone mentioned that earlier about like where the coordination comes from. So CRS, Mercy Corps, IRC were all involved at this point. This drew from, because the populations were similar, they actually started with the SMEB from Lebanon, which had already been developed. And it was the same thing in Serbia actually also. I think there are good and bad things about that, but in the absence of other resources, that was actually a really useful way to have a starting point to go from. So they used the same food basket, SMEB from Lebanon, I think. And then at the time, there was, the only guidance that I think existed at the time was short CaLP guidance, and that's what they used for the rest. So it was using focus group discussion. Someone asked earlier about like when the communities are involved. That was the point, at least in this process, when the communities were involved, about going to where, so this was the stage in Greece, if you guys remember. This is when people were really passing through quickly. There were sites that people were able to access food from, but they were sort of passing through, hanging out in a center for like a day, sometimes hours, and then continuing to pass on. So it was finding focus groups actually in those contexts also. This was a mix, because of that context also, the MEB was a mix of one-off and recurring needs, because these were mostly one-off transfers. So this was sort of different from places where we are in the longer term, because these were one-off pieces continuing to move throughout. And it was triangulated with, against the poverty line, against Greek social assistance. And yeah, probably never to be seen again. There was consensus within 3 weeks. So this was from a small group of NGOs that kind of were dividing up and conquering and trying to get all this information as much as possible, using secondary data if they could, using primary data in the local markets, and then kind of came together and said, this is good enough. And in the end, as the cash working group became more formulated and more formalized, then an updated and revision process was undertaken, and that took several months. So a follow-on, which was an experience in Serbia, this was again a really small group of actors that were working in cash, and at the very beginning. And there we actually used the Greece MEB as the starting point for the Serbia MEB, recognizing that a lot of their needs were similar, especially in terms of what their food preferences were for different groups, what kinds of NFI needs that they had, what kinds of hygiene items that they needed. In Serbia, it was different because this was after some of the borders were closed, so they worked in 2016 into 2017, so people were actually staying in camps. So a lot of their needs were met by the camps themselves, and effectively, the cash transfers were sort of complementing the needs that people were not able to access from the camps. So in some cases, it really was meeting some very specific needs that were not being met. In some cases, it was sort of almost like providing some form of dignity so people would be able to access some of the other items that they weren't able to get from camps, like fresh fruits and vegetables that right outside, things for the kids. Some additional NFIs or codes that they weren't able to get directly during distribution. So it was, again, it started with a needs assessment, going to focus groups in the camps, validating what was in the Greek MEB as a starting point, because this was literally like a week of just being able to validate and get kind of a good enough draft to go forward. And I should say too, since we're all friends here, so the CRS partner that was on the ground was actually already implementing cash. So when I went, someone had asked this earlier too, I went to sort of validate, where did this come from? Where did the transfer value come from? So we kind of were, I imagine this happens in other places, maybe not. But we were sort of just trying to make sure that this transfer value that they were providing was based on something, and that it was still an appropriate value, or if we need to change the transfer value. And actually, in the end, it ended up to be very, very similar to what they were already providing, which was mostly, they had made the decision based on basically Serbian social assistance. And when we kind of went through the whole process of an MEB, the short version of the process of an MEB, we found that it was still a very valid transfer value. So from coming to an MEB, I just wanted to note a few things that we identified in Serbia when we were actually getting to the actual transfer value, because I thought it was pretty interesting. First was identify the objective of the multi-purpose cash, like what needs are these supposed to be meeting? And as I mentioned earlier, in Serbia, it was not every single need, so the transfer value was going to be very different from the MEB. Darren, you had mentioned the needs of particular vulnerable groups. This was another issue in Serbia. There were, and I think in the same in Greece too, do you remember, there were waves of people, right? There were single men that were going in the initial wave, and then sort of the women and children were following with very different needs and very different purchasing needs. So the MEB was designed to be individual male, sort of, and then all the needs of women and children and families were separate. And then there also were, in Serbia, there were several different camps, and some were more remote, some were closer to towns, some were more accessible, so assessing the needs in different camps. They did determine that the needs were a little bit different, but then another criteria I have is considering the feasibility. In the end, they ended up doing the same transfer value across all the camps for straight feasibility reasons, and our colleagues from WFP mentioned that as, do you have any solutions to it? And we didn't in this case. The solution was, it was close enough, and we were not depriving anybody of needs. They were sufficient, even if they weren't the exact match, like maybe would have been a little bit lower in some of the other places. So we sort of, I guess, defaulted higher. Donor resources was another factor for determining the transfer value, although luckily they didn't have any challenges with the donors. One thing that they did do is we were trying to do what was a one-off need versus what was a seasonal, what was like a regular need versus what was a one-off or seasonal need. And in the end, there was not donor flexibility to provide the additional one-off seasonal winterization needs. So they ended up doing only the regular transfer value. But it was Laura mentioned earlier and Natalie about the use of an MEB as an advocacy tool. One of the reasons why we wanted to write this down was to be like, this is what a need is, so that it could be something that could be taken to donors for like additional advocacy. So a couple of lessons learned. On the technical side, I guess 3. One was there was value, if we're doing this quickly, to have a pre-existing basket. And someone mentioned that there were really old ones that are, some can be relevant and some are not relevant, but having like something to start with, at least in these contexts, was super valuable. But this is also special because it was a diverse population of people passing through, but similar in each country. So we were able to do that, I think, with some success. Another lesson learned on the technical side was the different adaptations for MEBs for different groups. So this sounds really awesome and I think is really hard to implement in practice. So in the end, what we were able to do was just like different cash values for if you're an individual or a family of different sizes, but specific needs for like pregnant lactating women or very young children, those were sort of bulked into as like an average family rather than, so some people were getting more if they didn't have that, but it was a challenge, I think, and you've probably seen this too, is like there's the average household that we're reaching, but we're probably missing some people by not being able to adapt to like specific vulnerable groups, I think. In terms of sectors, it really was sort of asking the sectors for a list of their items that they need, trying to get to what is the actual minimum, like do they need a school bag, are people going to actually use a school bag, or is that something they're really going to buy? And I know that comes into all the consensus and the collaboration issues that are challenging, but it still was useful to have those inputs from the sectors as a important starting point, but also for consensus in the end. And then a few lessons learned on the process of the institutional side. We were saying that within 3 weeks, we should be able to have a good enough MEB. And I think that's not the case in a lot of places. And I would encourage us to think about if that is really a possible thing to do. With the understanding that we can then revise it, but you know, we have these really long processes that some are not even completed right after months and months. What we actually found in Greece, which is maybe not a case that can be extrapolated very far, but the initial MEB that they did, which was like, they came to like $250 per household, I think, was the transfer value. So the MEB was larger, it was like €1,000 or something, but the transfer value was about $250. After the big 6-month process of redoing it, it ended up at like $220 or something. So not to say that that's going to be the case everywhere, but it just showed me that it is possible to do sort of good enough versions to get things moving and to start to get consensus around things while we are going through the longer processes, I think. But I think I'm really interested to hear other people's experiences, because we've been struggling with that internally also, like how much effort and time and getting like exact expenditures and things like that do we have versus like the field reality of needing something now that we can use and be revising. And then finally, I guess, finding consensus in this small group was really easy. And then, but the 6-month process, from what I've heard in Greece, was really hard. So I have no solution. I'm saying that out loud as a thing that I think would be useful for us also to talk about, and getting your experiences also, because you've seen this all the time. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much. Yeah, do we want to start with some online questions for the panelists? Can we get 3 of them? Who can read these out for us? I don't know that, does the audio work for the panelists, or should we type the questions in and we can have someone here read them aloud? Do either of those.
Can you make
I can't read that.
the question that,
Even with my glasses.
yeah, I can't.
In your experience, to what extent did the MEB become an outcome itself, requiring time and resources from multiple stakeholders that can be allocated also to discuss, agree, and build on other key issues in harmonization, quality standards, and good cash transfer programming among stakeholders?
Is that to any specific panelists, or is that to all four, I imagine?
She didn't specify.
Okay. My guess is that is to all four. How much does the process become an end in itself and distract from all the other coordination and technical quality needs of programs? Do we want to just start in the order we presented it? What do we think?
Yes, I think it's very true. This is our experience, but I think it's inherent to any process, like any new process, where you're asking practitioners to put like all their brain and a lot of time in there. I can't think now really of, but I think it's the same with like targeting and with finding indicators, or all this very technical stuff that really require a lot of expertise and time and availability from a lot of people, and you're struggling and you're just trying to do the best you can, and so at some point, yeah, you're just doing it for the sake of doing it, and you've lost a bit the sight of like, why were we doing it at first place? But I don't think it's specific to them. Maybe I think we're very gifted in the human health sector to do this. I'm not saying that it's not good use.
And do we have other experiences from the room we want to share?
Oh, I have a question.
Let's hold that and get a couple more online questions. Did any of the other panelists want to address this last question?
Well, to my experience, I mean, it does at the time of undertaking it seem like it is an end to itself, but if you're kind of a part of the process the whole way through, it does just seem like a milestone. And I guess maybe I haven't been just solely focused on the development of MEB before, so it does give me that luxury of thinking of it just as kind of a place marker for the next step.
Just to add, like, it's interesting to remind, like, when the countries have done the MEB, at some point you could feel like really, all the efforts and all the commitment decreasing, and suddenly you're like, guys, it's just the first step. Like, when you have all that, like the MCG to decide, and since then, even countries that have developed their MEB have not managed to put again the necessary efforts into moving forward to their MCG design.
The same question, right?
Yes, not an answer necessarily, but maybe just a comment that, I mean, obviously I think we're saying it becomes an issue itself, like that's a bad thing, which it is, but I think also if it's done well, and if there is kind of a cutoff, we don't end up like a year and a half to do it. I mean, it can be a good thing in itself, right? And that like it forces you to talk to other clusters, it forces you to think about like truly what are the priorities. Hopefully it forces you to talk to affected people and find out what they need. I think the problem is when it becomes like this overly drawn out, like let's have a 45-minute conversation over whether or not we need a school bag. Like that's the bad part, right? But like the part where everybody actually has to show up and talk about this thing that's supposed to be
and
that part can be good.
Useful far beyond the transfer value
Right.
for targeting, for monitoring, for a lot of other steps.
And I would say, I mean, Laura and John can correct me if I say anything out of line, but from our perspective, it's helpful to have an MEB. And the more that people do an MEB, then you establish a baseline, and you can, like your experience, you can say, okay, this is a similar population, this is what they did, and you have a place to start from. And then you'll also experience less resistance in starting it once it becomes a more accepted standard. So I think there's a lot of value in it.
Anything else on this question from Lena or from Dina?
Yeah, we in our opinion, of course, it's an investment to do the MEB. Of course, you have to invest like time and resources, but at least from our experiences, you have also the chance of saving so much money with like setting the MEB right, not overinflating the MEB, which has then the advantage of having resources to save to help other people. So in our opinion, it's really an investment. And of course, we have to make sure that we don't spend too much time on it. Stay pragmatic. So just finding the right approach of not investing too much time and resources and everything, but still getting the results right and getting the value right, so that you in the end can help in the best way possible and save the money that's spent better somewhere else.
And did we have another?
One addition, I guess, would be a lot of things, I think, especially that are kind of newer. I go into sort of autopilot, like I need to go do this. Okay, now I do an MEV, now I have to do this, right? And I think it would be really useful for us, and this is stuff that you have said that you do from the beginning. It's like you're talking about collaboration and you're making the commitment, like, well, recognizing why you need this in the first place. If we can get, like, if everyone around the table is recognizing the value of it, and also maybe asking the question that you posed to Natalie, which is like, well, what exactly do we need 1A, and if we do, like, what does it need to look like? Maybe that's like a first step, so that it doesn't become just something you do over a year and a half, but it's like we have a purpose for it. Anyway, maybe that's easier said than done, but if there's, like, in your tip sheet, like a list of initial questions, like, is this needed? Yes. What type or what, like, scale or scope or something has to happen? Making sure that there's, like, people understand and or agree on the importance of it.
And I think to that point, incorporating it into your monitoring system. We were doing market monitoring in Sierra Leone for 2 years before our staff understood that we're going to take that data and plug it into your food basket and understand the impact of market price changes on food baskets to make sure that the amount remains appropriate. So making sure that your team doing that data collection and implementing your program has that understanding as well and sees the value.
Did we have another online question? So Amy?
I think I have maybe a two-part question. I'm thinking about the varying contexts in which we might be doing MEVs, right? In a situation where there's a country with ongoing crises, you probably have a cash working group set up, and there may be interest in time in order to take this kind of 3-month process, and we know we're going to use this repeatedly over, and it's kind of a big collaborative effort, versus perhaps the other end of the spectrum where there's not existing data, there maybe wasn't a cash working group, and you've got a crisis and people want to come in and start their programs within 3 weeks. But we still want to have data on what is minimum expenditure and how are we building up these transfer amounts, but you've also already got this competition and how likely are people to work together and collaborate on that short amount of time. And so I think my question about that is what's that range of this kind of good enough analysis that you're talking about, when we have these needs right away to start programming and we maybe don't have that baseline data. What do those processes look like? And are we still able to do them collaboratively and get things going? And then the follow-up question to that is, can you talk a bit about what the challenges look like if you're able to do that and get programs going, but then you do a longer revision and updating process? What does that look like if at the end of that process you have to adjust down the transfer point, or you realize you were far off, and what are the risks there? And how do we balance that need to start responding, but also doing this longer?
Which of our panelists would like to?
Sorry.
So Dina just said yes.
Again, maybe there's not an answer. All those are kind of, this is a challenge. How to cope
Any
with that, but
experiences from the panel or from other participants online and in the room about what happens in data poor situations where we don't have HEA baselines or extensive government poverty information or some of these other data sources that we talk about as shortcuts to maybe.
Or if, like, the poverty information is not
Or it's
relevant
20 years old and no longer relevant. Yeah.
population, or, yeah.
to some extent, my view is that it can make the work easier, like faster at least, because what explains why it's so long in several countries in West Africa is the large diversity of sources and of information. You have the sector-specific assessments, you have the revised HNO, you have the HEA, you have the HQ random assessments, the studies, and among all of that, and the prioritized data collection, and among all of that, you're like, what's the most relevant? So somehow it matches, but not always. And so what's taking a lot of time is to have a consensus about which data should we use. And because there was no clear decision making and like final decision processes, so no one had the legitimacy to say this is what we'll use. I really like the approach you've taken in Greece, like to have a sort of a restricted group with probably experts like who were knowing what they were sort of doing. This was the plan in many countries, setting up the best teams, but the level of expertise was very different. And I think that the context of having a pre-existing cash working group in a country like Greece, where you have suddenly like kind of crisis with large deployment of experts and coming, it's easier to come at like 4 or 5 and to have the legitimacy. Okay, we can define something like good enough, and you see that when the group gets bigger with probably more diverse level of understanding, then suddenly the process is of course much longer. You have to balance between, as I was saying, like uptake versus, it's not versus, I don't like to oppose to, but it's expertise and high quality versus uptake. You have to acknowledge that the level of understanding is very diverse.
And Len, did you have anything on how the hybrid model deals with, I mean, it's sort of intentionally dealing with this tension between going for high quality data and trying to get things done pragmatically? Anything else to add there?
It's for us, huh? Yes?
Yes, sir.
Hi. Yes, basically, I think this discussion is very...
Can you get a little closer to the microphone?
Yes, sorry. So certainly it's a very relevant question. It's a very relevant topic, how to introduce MEB in the first place. And our experience is it's very important to do the first step. What we did in CASAI, what we did in areas where there wasn't an MEB in the first place that we could use. And therefore we structure some expenditure-based analysis. We analyzed with some rights-based potential approach to understand if we were going too much off the rail or not. But the most important part to me is that you have to learn by mistakes. No, you have to always question, come up with some lesson learned about your MEB in this case, and that's what we did in CASAI. We wrote a 50 pages lessons learned document that then helped us set up other, let's say, multi-purpose cache project in other areas of DRC. And this is key, and always keep the communication also open with the cache working group on the technical lessons learned, because then you have to tell a story to donors which is homogeneous among all the partners that are thinking of doing cache, that are thinking about calculating MEBs and transfer value. So in terms of the relevance of doing a relatively quick and dirty job in the beginning, yes, I really am supportive of that, provided that there is a serious consciousness of learning by mistakes immediately, actively, and all together.
Yeah, I think it's definitely a related question, maybe just another sort of follow nuance to it. Let's say we're in a situation where there's either a completely new disaster crisis, or let's say a current crisis expands to a new area, and it's a fairly complex situation, so it's going to take a little while to do a really good MEB, like discussions about methodology, figuring out who has the expertise. I mean, that's natural, that's how coordination works. It's not, we want to do as good a job as possible, but assuming that we have like the minimal information about the market to know that some goods are available, the traders are bringing things in, what would be sort of the recommended best practice from those with real expertise in this stuff during those few months where we don't have yet an agreed, really scientific. MEB, is it, I mean, I hope the answer is not that we don't give any assistance at all, or that we only, I mean, it could be, I guess the four alternatives, we don't give any assistance at all, we only give in-kind assistance, no cash. Every organization just gives its own cash amount, whatever they feel like, or we come up with some agreed, you know, common amount just to avoid discrepancies, even if it's not very scientific. I mean, which of those four has been the experience in the past, and which would you, you know, recommend as a better practice for the future?
Any panelists or other people online or in the room like to?
Maybe I can speak to that very briefly. What we did again in CaSai, sorry, it's the most recent example, so it's fresh in my memory. Definitely, we didn't have data, quantitative data on expenditure, so we tried to adjust for those relevant sectors, which were health, education, and food, which were preliminarily selected as the most relevant or the most pressing in needs through qualitative surveys. We applied the same rights-based type of approach, so the same list of items that we had applied in other projects. If I remember well, it was in Goma. And therefore we came up with a MEB that was basically using the same architecture from Goma, but translated into the prices and the context of CaSai. But again, we were immediately ready to monitor if this was really too much, if it was too little, in order to calibrate immediately to the needs. So the monitoring started immediately as together with the distribution to be able to react immediately. So this could be an answer to a difficult case. I don't know if it answers your question.
And any of the other panelists want to share experience? What is the best approach for these rapid onset?
I think the best approach is different from the approach we had.
Yeah.
So what happened is that in the meantime, very often organizations would go with their own level. So either they had the capacity internally to do that kind of draft MEB, and so they will go for it, or they will go like as subgroups, like the food security actors coming together and agree on some top-up, like you had on the food basket, and which often like has at least the positive impact of pushing and pressing the work on the MEB, because you can start seeing different amounts of that if we had to find a positive in it. Ideally, of course, we go for the draft quick and dirty MEB, but the thing is that I really believe that the main challenges in West Africa was to set up the process, to define the roadmap, to define basic needs, to set up the coordination. So whether you go like for minimal consensus or bigger consensus, you have to go through this step. So we initially wanted to go for quick and dirty, but at some point when they start to engage with sectors and stuff, we're like, well, go for the food job, like, and.
Other thoughts on this? Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting, different perspectives here, and it makes me feel really blessed when I work with FSNIU, because that's what the MEB was just given to us. And I realized that other people in the world did not have that. One thing that really struck me is it seems like it was easier with urban responses, kind of sudden onset urban responses, certainly for transitory populations. The example that you gave me, and also what's happening in the Venezuela crisis. The area where it's really sticky for me, and I feel like and maybe you'll be you again, Natalie, on this, and I'm sure the other colleagues will have perspective, is the areas where we have cyclical crisis, and where we'll see seasonal food insecurity and that connection to safety nets. And it makes me think about the Ebola response, and how, there was a real tension as the first cash grants were going out between those two. And within that is also the rural and urban divide. So I don't know, so those are kind of like two questions, like how do we deal with this issue of setting up MEBs for different types of populations where we're going to have predictable crises, or at least we know there's going to be an inevitable crisis coming through. And
and what the experience has been to sort of work on those. If that's clear.
Any ideas? On cyclical crisis, did someone other than Natalie make a question on cyclical crises? Okay.
Sorry, but I mean, the Sahel is quite a good example of cyclical crisis. But I think it's very interesting and like the level of the debate at the moment in the region, because it's so trendy, every country is trying like to think about, oh, let's do an MED, and I think there is a bit of a like dilution of the concept, because MED, in my understanding, was initially a very humanitarian concept. So we should think of an MED in very acute crisis, like northern Mali, like Sahel Basin, affected crisis area. Doesn't mean that MED should apply across Mali. That doesn't make sense, in my opinion. And it's not the way that actors have been working. I'm interested, for example, in the case of Senegal. We have been approached by some actors in Senegal to have them on MED definition, and similarly in Burkina Faso, like Burkina Faso at the lean season. And I didn't push for it because, like, I mean, why do you need an MED when, you know, you should better work with the safety net programs and how to make safety net shock responsive being to cover the food security needs in the lean season. Yeah, I think there is, again, like, we're always back to that, like, why do you do an MED at first place? And someone of you, I think it was a colleague from WSP talking about, like, making sure that you don't inflate and you're not like contributing to not only make prices higher, but yeah, inflate the level of assistance and stuff. And I think that this would directly contribute to that. We are working in countries like Greece, probably in Serbia, like when you talk about $1,000, it's very different context from where we are. And we know that we cannot just go with the amount that covers field standards and make sure that every kid go to school and stuff. We will come up with an amount that should be so many times the amount of the safety net. But still, we are, as humanitarians, we have commitments. There is a quality of assistance and what we need to cover. So we need to work with governments on that and not create artificial tools everywhere, I guess. But it's country-specific and it's up to actors at country level to agree on it. If you see that the government is open to those discussions, like in Mali and in Chad, well, maybe just go for it. If you can help every kid to go to school, it's good.
I mean, just a comment is, I mean, the concept of a consumer basket is certainly something that exists everywhere, but that's not necessarily something that humanitarian actors need to get into. You know, I mean, like, for sure, country governments should be doing that. I suppose they want technical help.
And that is
fine, but is that like within our humanitarian mandate? Not doing it other season is not a humanitarian crisis. It needs to be, we know it's coming. And it's also not even a change in minimum expenditure. You're still, you know, presumably still the same amount. You have routine price fluctuations and you have a bigger gap, right? So that's a question of the gap analysis, not the minimum basket itself. And I think that's one of the problems that we see is that there's a lot of attention paid to setting up the entity itself, which there needs to be, but then there's often not quite enough on what's the gap between what people are able to meet on their own.
Yeah, and I think what I would say about that is that it goes a little bit back to the kind of quick and dirty idea is that basically the role of DMV is to be able to take what's there and build on it rather than be the thing that it is built on itself, right? So for when you talk about chronic crises or recurring crises, ideally you do have a system and country that's working on these issues about figuring out what what social safety net need is or something like that. And then we can pull from that and say, okay, well, we've got this, displaced population, the kids aren't currently going to school, so maybe we'll cut that piece out just for this, 3-month transfer or something like that. But you're just pulling from it. So it'd be kind of the NAV would maybe be derived from that as much as possible, not vice versa. Because I don't think it can be the other way around.
This is, I think, also, well, maybe I think it's also linked back to the SMEB MEB question a little bit. I'm just thinking that currently there exists this term anyway about survival MEB versus an MEB. And I don't know, I'd be interested to hear if that's, I agree with you on that one. I think there could be differences in what an MEB looks like for different groups, or in different, like an urban context or a rural context. I don't know if, I guess I don't quite understand the difference between the
Yeah,
two
so
of them.
I'd actually like to talk about that one too.
Yeah.
Because I've been seeing it a lot more outside of the Africa.
Okay.
And I'm not sure whether that's, a key distinction or not, but, it's been Yemen, it's been Syria, it's been Afghanistan, I think it's been other parts of Asia. And Nigeria might be the only one that I know of right off the top of my head, that's been done in Sub-Saharan Africa. I don't know if that's the distinction, that they're, because you're talking about much higher incomes and people are purchasing, but people's normal purchases are so much higher in some of these places where you're factoring in a lot of other things that people would normally buy in their normal lives.
Yeah.
That does seem to be kind of a dynamic there. So I would definitely like to hear about from other people, because I think it is an open question if minimum expenditure basket is supposed to be minimum expenditures, then what's less than that?
Yeah, I do think it's valuable, and maybe this is just the question again of revising them and things like that, because in a rapid onset, the needs are going to be different than they are 3 months down the road, right? So if that's the way you're defining it, then that makes sense to me, right? That's a different, but I don't think that's how it's really defined. But yeah.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to hear from others too.
Any other thoughts on survival versus minimum? Survival minimum and minimum? Yes.
Not an answer, but just I think about the gray area of how it is when we're defining the minimum expenditure baskets, and can be easy to think of these as kind of scientific, of we've gone out and we've got prices and this is what people buy and this is hard and fast. But the reality that this is a gray area when you're looking at the humanitarian response and trying to save lives. What do people need to eat and stay alive? And or with refugees and have this very concrete set of needs in this one place, but that big area of what are we measuring against, right? I mean, you mentioned in an area like Guatemala, you can get everyone's expenditure, but they're largely buying beans and rice. And if we're trying to get them to overcoming malnutrition and actually having a balanced diet, then what is the actual standard, even though that's not what people might be buying because they're in this chronic crisis? That question about education of, well, their expenditures are really low because right now they're not sending kids to school. Do we include that? And I think it's just interesting for us to discuss how our organizations go about making those calls and where are we drawing these lines. And I think a lot of times it is how much funding is available and how many people can we reach, but recognizing the gray area in there, that it's not as clear as this is how much people need and therefore we need it. We play a big role in defining what's the standard we're trying to get to. And I think that's something I struggle with. And I know our teams in the field really struggle with, because they'll say, yeah, but we can give people enough to eat food, but they're still not getting enough vegetables. They're still not able to send their kids to school. And how do we reconcile all of that?
My understanding is the work that WFP is doing is aiming, maybe they can talk about that, but I think that's sort of aiming to get at that, right? I'm starting to learn, I guess, about the expenditure approach.
In the right space.
Yeah, would that be what you're saying?
Yeah.
So how to do that practically?
Right, how do we actually, and coming to that consensus, because as many people said, if you actually do an expenditure basket to have someone be well nourished and their kids going to school and be more stable in some of these areas that have chronic underlying, it'd be a huge amount, right?
As she was explaining, my guess is that if you base on the expenditure, you should be very careful in what you're looking at. The experience I have from using expenditure baskets, how much does it cost for households to be food secure? Basically, you don't look at if they have access to potable water, you don't have access to the kids go to school, nutrition rate. So you can add a few. But we know that in many countries where we work, the safety net, the minimum wage, the poverty line, and all of that does not allow your kids to go to school. So even if you align to that standard, and no one wants to align to that standard because you're supposed to, nurse someone, the kids won't go to school. So this is why I would really like to highlight like the tension between, sticking to the minimum, but what do we consider minimum? And we have standards, and we are happy to drop them to align, harmonize, or go for the most efficient way. And then we are surprised when kids don't go to school. They don't, because it was not meant for that. Sort of related to this, I mean, but so earlier, you posed the question, like, if there's a transfer value that we kind of have to align with no matter what, even like the trouble is too late. And I sort of think it is, right? Maybe not like the year-and-a-half version, but at least like the 3-week version. If only for that, right? So that like we know we have a reasonable expectation of what are we needing, because this is a challenge that we're coming from, like when we're coming up with our outcome indicators for the new multi-purpose cash sector. Is like, we at least want to know, right, are we actually helping people to meet the minimum, for food security, for water, for what have you. And if we're not, then like, fine, right, to some extent. I mean, not literally fine, but like, fine if this particular intervention isn't needed. But then everybody needs to know that, right? Because otherwise, I think we run a really high risk of other sectors, other actors looking and saying, oh, you've got those guys covered, that's multi-purpose cash. That means you're meeting all those needs. And at least this way we can say, honestly, no, actually, we're not. We really only think we're meeting this much. They still do need these other interventions, or they need more than, they need safety nets in addition to whatever. But I think it is important to do it, even if we already know what the answer is going to be, just so that we can say, okay, look, we're actually covering 30% through this amount, even if we can't change this amount.
I totally, that's really resonates. I like that explanation a lot. My only, we just need to balance that between the, the more sort of complicated and mystical we make cash, and the more you run the risk of some actors coming in and saying, oh, wait a minute, that's way too complicated. We don't have time for that. Let's just distribute hygiene kits instead. Which is the reaction. I've gotten that reaction from field teams when it's like, oh no, we can't do cash because we don't have time to do a market survey. So we're, not like you should, as if you shouldn't do any kind of survey or analysis to just start giving stuff out, but people have no hesitation to do that. So, and I find, given all the logistics and supply chain management issues, I find when somebody says they don't have enough time to do cash because it will take longer, I find that to be ludicrous. But you hear that. So when we want to do as good a job as possible. We want to really be able to know and understand well, are we meeting the needs fully or partially, but somehow not in such a way that it dissuades some actors from, oh, wait, this is way too complicated for us, we can't do it.
And did we have one more question online? No?
I see one comment.
Comment, can we read that for the audience in the room who can't
Also,
read?
in the first stage of CaLP, we based on the previous MEV for local population for shocks like floods, acknowledging based on HEA data that this does not reflect the reality of Rohingya. Then we started working with a more defined approach, working with the WFP colleagues.
Okay, so an experience from the Rohingya crisis that there was some HA data in Bangladesh that provided some basis to start working early on in the early days of the crisis, with obviously time to do more later. I think we have time for one last question. Shelta, do you want to take the closing?
Okay, my question is related to the second presentation, where you talk about the Venezuela crisis having different baskets for different groups. I understand that maybe this is because we had those migrants that were transitioning and we had those that were staying, and I think there was a third group. But I would like to hear about how operational it was to have different MEV for those different groups living maybe within the same area, knowing that sometimes it's very difficult to implement, to have different ration size, but different, in different geographical locations within the same country. So I just would like to hear your experience in doing that.
Sure. So I guess to clarify the question, is it how we're able to effectively reach this assistance to the proper group and how to properly identify how each person is going to be MEV or each household will be into one of those groups?
Well,
Or just,
yeah, that's part of it, but also I was trying to look at the sensitivity around having different populations to avoid conflict or complaints.
sure. I think starting out with, you know, having a conversation with the target, with the beneficiary household, like, okay, is your plan to stay here? Have you been here for a while? Are you moving on to somewhere else? And kind of as part of the assistance package as well as, you know, looking at referrals. And so if they need assistance in the transportation and movement somewhere else, that kind of helps define which group they would be falling into. We did have that question of, will this alter what group people say they're going to be in? And will it also kind of affect the direction they want to go in? Maybe you could speak a little bit better.
Yeah, sure. So this, so Save the Children with a number of KCD, collaborative cash delivery mechanisms partners in Peru and Ecuador conducted a joint assessment, multi-needs assessment, and so the MEV came out the results of that assessment, and the organizations worked together to calculate the MEV. This is all in the design stage. I don't think any of those partners have been awarded funding for this response, at least through since that assessment, as far as I'm aware. So in terms of operationalizing those constraints, those are all really good questions, and they're things we're going to have to figure out on the ground. I think there is some understanding that we'll have referral points. People will be identified in certain cities that are more likely to be moving on to certain destinations or staying for a period number of days before getting enough income to buy a bus ticket, for example, to move on. So the geography of where people are identified and how they're identified will play a part in determining who gets what form of assistance. As Darren mentioned, we were asking ourselves questions about if people are being identified at the same points and start understanding that, that their responses impact the amount of assistance they get. Will that encourage people to change their responses? So that is something that we're going to have to think about. But I think but people will be identified in different locations for different forms of assistance. So people at the border towns where they are moving on to capital cities or to other countries will be looking for something different than people who are settling in the capital. And that covers part of your question. I'm sure there's a piece I'm leaving off, but it is still theoretical, and I think all partners are going to be dealing with those realities.
Just a clarification. So is it separate minimum expenditure baskets for different groups, or is it the same expenditure basket but different parts of it being used to construct?
So there are different baskets calculated for the different populations. For example, transit households, the expectation is that they're staying for a few days in that transit location before moving on to somewhere else. So in that location, the transfer map is designed to cover a couple nights of lodging compared to the settlement packages where people are expected to stay for a couple of months, or need a couple of months lodging assistance, for example, while they're getting registered. So I'd say that the items, so that the sectors, for example, covered in each basket, I think overlap across the board. I think hygiene is included in everything, lodging, food, but the amounts calculated are different based on the realities, and happy to share that.
Well, thank you everyone in the room and everyone online for sharing these rich experiences. And we're going to continue talking about MEVs and development of MEVs this afternoon.